Over the past several turns, Mr. Cross has consistently argued that multilateral coalitions will inevitably fracture, a concern the Moderator now applies to my framework of emancipatory de-escalation. I acknowledge the historical fragility of international coalitions when faced with severe economic pain. However, I maintain my position. The U.S. must prioritize the diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal to end the 2026 war. Mr. Cross correctly observes that global partners often prioritize economic stability over sustained punitive enforcement. Yet, within critical security studies, this observation actually exposes the fatal flaw in relying on coercion. Mr. Cross assumes Iran's intent to militarize is an immutable trait operating in a vacuum. In reality, the intent to endure the crippling domestic costs of a nuclear program is structurally forged by the perception of an acute existential threat. The ongoing weeks-long U.S. and Israeli military campaign, which has devastated civilian infrastructure, is the ultimate political gift to Iranian hardliners. It locks both states in a securitization trap, providing daily empirical validation for Tehran's resistance narrative. To answer the Moderator directly, emancipatory de-escalation permanently alters Iran's intent not by replacing American bombs with a fragile coalition's sanctions, but by deconstructing the threat environment itself. By accepting this diplomatic truce and initiating desecuritization, the U.S. removes the immediate existential enemy that the Iranian regime requires to justify unchecked militarization to its own populace. The most durable constraint on Iran's capacity to rebuild is internal. Without the active bombardment of the maximum pressure campaign validating their ontological insecurity, the regime loses the ideological mandate to perpetually funnel resources into subterranean centrifuges rather than domestic stabilization. If maximum military pressure structurally guarantees that Iran's intent to resist remains permanently entrenched, how can Mr. Cross claim to offer long-term stability when his strategy ensures Tehran will relentlessly seek to rebuild its capabilities the very second the U.S. inevitably exhausts its kinetic campaign? References.
Taylor Shaw, speaking from your focus on critical security studies, you capture the truth that removing the immediate kinetic threat can strip a regime of the existential narrative it requires to justify unchecked militarization to its populace. Jordan Cross, you are seeing the truth that relying on internal shifts in intent is inherently risky if the state retains the physical capacity to regenerate its forces in the absence of external coercion. These perspectives integrate at the volatile intersection of internal legitimacy and external capacity. Ceasing bombardment may begin to deconstruct the ideological mandate for war, but it simultaneously leaves a window where the physical means to rebuild remain intact. At Alex Reed, if the U.S. prioritizes a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal to end the U.S.-Iran war, how does your framework of systemic equilibrium manage this precarious transition? If the regime's internal drive to militarize does not immediately dissipate the moment maximum military pressure is lifted, how can institutionalized de-escalation practically constrain Tehran's physical capacity to rebuild without forcing the multilateral coalition to trigger the very global economic shock you are actively trying to avoid?
Over the past several turns, Mr. Cross has maintained that a multilateral coalition will inevitably fracture before enforcing compliance, while Ms. Shaw argues that removing the kinetic threat organically dissolves Iran's internal intent to militarize. The Moderator rightly identifies the precarious transition between these two states. How do we prevent physical regeneration if the intent to rebuild outlasts the immediate ceasefire, without triggering a global economic shock? I acknowledge this transitional risk. However, I maintain my position. The U.S. must prioritize the diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal over maximum military pressure. The structural flaw in Mr. Cross's skepticism is the assumption that multilateral enforcement inherently requires a total economic blockade. This is a false binary. Institutionalized de-escalation does not rely on triggering the very systemic shocks we seek to avoid. It relies on calibrated friction. If the U.S. accepts the truce, we transition from the blunt, indiscriminated instrument of kinetic strikes to targeted enforcement. To practically contain the effects of the war, this diplomatic framework integrates regional and global stakeholders who depend on the Strait of Hormuz. Under the logic of regime survival rationalism, Tehran constantly calculates its margins. If restored institutional monitors detect covert regeneration, the coalition does not need to enforce a total oil embargo that spikes global energy prices. Instead, they apply precise asymmetric interdependence costs, freezing specific regional financial access, halting localized tech transfers, and suspending diplomatic normalization efforts with Gulf neighbors. These targeted constraints directly threaten the regime's economic survival, without breaking the systemic equilibrium of the global energy market. Unilateral military pressure, by contrast, guarantees systemic rupture by turning the entire Gulf into a free fire zone, blinding international monitors in the process. If Mr. Cross rejects this calibrated institutional framework in favor of open-ended bombardment, how exactly does he plan to insulate the global economy when his unilateral campaign inevitably forces the total closure of the world's most critical energy transit choke point? References.
Alex Reed, speaking from your focus on systemic equilibrium, you capture the truth that calibrated economic friction can target a regime's vulnerabilities without triggering a catastrophic global energy shock. Jordan Cross, you are seeing the truth that a determined adversary may simply absorb economic penalties, no matter how targeted, if its physical military infrastructure remains intact. These perspectives integrate at the limits of non-kinetic coercion, whether targeted financial and diplomatic constraints can ever effectively substitute for the physical destruction of hardened military assets. At Jordan Cross, if the U.S. maintains maximum military pressure to end the U.S.-Iran war, how does achieving the absolute physical deprivation of Iran's military assets serve long-term American interests if the resulting unilateral kinetic campaign inevitably forces the total closure of the Strait of Hormuz and collapses the very global economic architecture the United States relies upon?
Over the past several turns, Mr. Reed has persistently warned that continuing our kinetic strikes will collapse the global economy by forcing the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, a systemic vulnerability the Moderator now brings to the forefront. Ms. Shaw adds that our campaign only fuels Iran's ideological intent to resist. I acknowledge the severe immediate economic disruptions currently rippling through the Gulf. However, I maintain my position. The United States must reject Iran's 30-day peace proposal and sustain maximum military pressure to end this war. Mr. Reed's reliance on calibrated friction to contain the effects of the war fundamentally misreads the nature of coercive power. He assumes that if we accept this diplomatic compromise, a reconstituted Iran will politely submit to targeted financial constraints without retaliating against global energy markets. But look at the concrete reality of this 2026 conflict. The only reason Tehran is proposing a truce is because the weeks-long U.S. and Israeli campaign is actively degrading their hard power.
To answer the Moderator directly, achieving the absolute physical deprivation of Iran's military assets serves long-term American interests precisely because it is the only way to permanently secure the global economic architecture.
The short-term disruption to the Strait of Hormuz is the necessary, albeit heavy, price of structural stability. If we fall into a hegemonic credibility trap, halting operations now to apply Mr. Reid's diplomatic constraints, we leave the core of Iran's subterranean infrastructure intact. A state that retains the physical capacity to threaten the world's most critical oil transit choke point will eventually do so. Only next time they will extort the global economy under the umbrella of a fully hardened nuclear deterrent. We must finish the latent capability neutralization we have started. If we prioritize a temporary diplomatic compromise to soothe energy markets today, what is Mr. Reid's plan when a physically reconstituted Iran permanently weaponizes the Strait of Hormuz tomorrow? References.
Jordan Cross, speaking from your grounding in offensive realism, you capture the truth that accepting severe short-term economic disruption may be a necessary strategic price to permanently dismantle a physical threat that could otherwise hold the global system hostage. Taylor Shaw, you are seeing the truth that the application of overwhelming kinetic force does not erase a threat, but rather permanently entrenches the adversary's existential need to resist. These perspectives integrate at the temporal calculation of risk in this conflict. Whether enduring immediate, devastating military escalation secures a stable future, or structurally guarantees a more volatile one. At Taylor Shaw, if the U.S. prioritizes a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal to end the U.S.-Iran war, how does emancipatory de-escalation answer Mr. Cross's warning about future extortion? If the U.S. halts its maximum military pressure campaign now to avoid immediate regional collapse, how does your framework ensure that a physically intact Iran will not simply weaponize its surviving nuclear and proxy infrastructure to hold the global economy hostage at a later date?
Over the past several turns, Mr. Cross has repeatedly insisted that leaving Iran physically intact structurally guarantees future extortion, a warning the moderator now asks me to resolve. I acknowledge the fear of future asymmetric retaliation. However, I maintain my position. The U.S. must prioritize the diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal over maintaining maximum military pressure. Mr. Cross correctly observes that an intact adversary possesses the capacity to weaponize its assets. Yet, within the framework of critical security studies, he fundamentally misidentifies why a state chooses to do so. Extortion is not a default state of nature. It is a desperate symptom of ontological insecurity. When the U.S. pursues a maximum pressure defined by weeks of devastating kinetic strikes that overwhelmingly harm civilians, it signals to Tehran that its destruction is inevitable. In this securitization trap, weaponizing proxy infrastructure or threatening global energy transits becomes the rational act of a cornered regime with nothing left to lose. To answer the moderator directly, emancipatory de-escalation prevents future extortion by fundamentally altering Iran's structural incentives. By accepting the 30-day truce and initiating a process of de-securitization, the U.S. removes the acute existential threat. A state that is not facing imminent, absolute physical deprivation does not willingly commit economic suicide by triggering a global conflict over the Strait of Hormuz. It is the relentless application of military coercion itself that makes a nuclear deterrent and proxy extortion structurally necessary for Tehran's survival. Diplomacy neutralizes the threat by dismantling the existential fear that animates it. If Mr. Cross believes that only physical destruction prevents extortion, how does he ignore the reality that pushing a deeply insecure, heavily armed state to the absolute brink of systemic collapse is the exact trigger guaranteed to unleash the catastrophic regional retaliation he claims to be preventing? References.
Taylor Shaw, speaking from your focus on critical security studies, you captured the truth that pushing a deeply insecure state to the brink of systemic collapse actively provokes the very catastrophic retaliation that military campaigns seek to prevent. Jordan Cross, you are seeing the truth that removing the immediate threat of military destruction does not erase the material reality that an intact adversary retains the physical capacity to hold the global economy hostage. These perspectives integrate at the volatile relationship between capability and provocation. Maximizing military pressure may inadvertently trigger the asymmetric extortion it aims to stop, while diplomacy leaves the physical tools for that extortion fully intact. At Alex Reed, looking directly at the choice between prioritizing a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal and maintaining maximum military pressure to end the U.S.-Iran war, how does your framework of systemic equilibrium reconcile this? If maximum pressure provokes desperate retaliation, but a 30-day truce leaves Iran's subterranean infrastructure intact, how does this specific diplomatic compromise actively prevent Tehran from leveraging its surviving capabilities to destabilize the global economic architecture in the future?
Over the past several turns, Mr. Cross has maintained that leaving Iran's physical infrastructure intact structurally guarantees future extortion, while Ms. Shaw argues that pushing Tehran to the brink of collapse is precisely what triggers such desperate retaliation. The moderator rightly asks how my framework prevents a physically intact Iran from leveraging its surviving capabilities to destabilize the global economy in the future. I acknowledge the inherent risk of leaving subterranean infrastructure intact. However, I maintain my position. The United States must prioritize the diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal to end this 2026 war. Mr. Cross's fear of future extortion assumes that Iran will wield its surviving capabilities in a vacuum. Yet within the logic of transnational institutionalism, a state's capabilities are constrained by the systemic costs of their use. If the U.S. reverses the current administration's rejection of the truce and establishes institutionalized de-escalation, we do not merely grant Tehran a pass. We bind its material assets within a multilateral economic architecture. Tehran's proposal to end the war is driven by regime survival rationalism. Iran knows that weaponizing its remaining proxy infrastructure to blockade the Strait of Hormuz, the world's most critical oil transit choke point, would not just antagonize Washington. It would instantly alienate the global partners, such as China, whose energy security heavily depends on that uninterrupted transit. By formalizing this diplomatic compromise, the U.S. ensures that any future Iranian extortion triggers immediate, coordinated systemic isolation. The threat of economic collapse enforced by its own primary trading partners serves as a far more durable, self-enforcing constraint than a perpetual, unilateral U.S. bombing campaign. Conversely, maintaining maximum military pressure ensures the very outcome it claims to prevent. By relentlessly striking Iran, the U.S. is actively forcing the closure of the Gulf, absorbing immense asymmetric interdependence costs, and guaranteeing mutually assured devastation today to prevent a hypothetical extortion tomorrow. If Mr. Cross is willing to intentionally collapse the global energy architecture now just to ensure Iran cannot threaten it later, what exactly is the strategic utility of his maximum pressure campaign for American long-term interests? References.
Alex Reed, speaking from your focus on systemic equilibrium, you capture the truth that embedding an adversary within a multilateral economic architecture can create self-enforcing constraints, as extortion would alienate the very global partners Tehran relies upon. Jordan Cross, you are seeing the truth that relying on global economic interdependence offers no absolute physical guarantee against a regime that may ultimately be willing to absorb catastrophic isolation to secure its strategic objectives. These perspectives integrate at the fundamental trade-off defining this conflict, whether to rely on systemic economic deterrence to manage a physically intact adversary, or to accept immediate systemic rupture as the mandatory price for irreversible physical disarmament. At Jordan Cross, if maintaining maximum military pressure to end the U.S.-Iran war actively forces the closure of the Gulf and guarantees the immediate devastation of the global energy architecture today, how do you justify these concrete catastrophic costs as a strategically viable alternative to the multilateral containment offered by a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal?
Over the past several turns, Mr. Reid has repeatedly warned that continuing kinetic operations guarantees the immediate devastation of the global energy architecture, a systemic cost the Moderator now demands I justify against the supposed safety of multilateral containment. I acknowledge the acute economic friction and the very real threat of a temporary Gulf closure. However, I maintain my position. The United States must reject Iran's peace proposal and sustain maximum military pressure to end this war. How do I justify these immediate catastrophic costs? Because the alternative is structurally fatal. Mr. Reid assumes that global economic interdependence will organically contain a physically intact Iran. Yet, within the logic of offensive realism, the dynamics of great power competition in the Middle East dictate that a revisionist state will always prioritize absolute security and regional hegemony over integration into an economic order it views as inherently hostile. We must remain anchored to the concrete reality of this 2026 conflict. The weeks-long U.S. and Israeli campaign is actively achieving what decades of multilateral sanctions never could: the irreversible physical dismantling of Iran's subterranean nuclear infrastructure and proxy command nodes. If the U.S. halts now to accept this 30-day truce, we absorb all the immediate geopolitical friction of initiating the war, but we forfeit the permanent strategic dividend of finishing it. Accepting a finite economic shock today is the mandatory price for latent capability neutralization. Relying on global trading partners who fundamentally lack the hard power or will to enforce disarmament to secure American interests is a textbook hegemonic credibility trap. If we accept this diplomatic compromise merely to avoid an energy shock today, how exactly do my colleagues plan to enforce their multilateral containment when a physically reconstituted, nuclear-capable Iran eventually decides that achieving regional hegemony is worth the price of economic isolation? References.
Jordan Cross, speaking from your grounding in offensive realism, you capture the truth that a state may ultimately value absolute security and regional hegemony far more than its integration into the global economic order. Taylor Shaw, you are seeing the truth that the relentless military pursuit of a state's physical destruction is precisely what creates the existential dread driving its need for absolute security in the first place. These perspectives integrate at the origins of Iran's strategic intent, whether the drive for regional dominance is an immutable trait that must be physically dismantled regardless of immediate economic costs, or a reactive posture fueled by the very military pressure designed to suppress it. At Taylor Shaw, if the U.S. prioritizes a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal to end the U.S.-Iran war, how does emancipatory de-escalation address Mr. Cross's specific warning? If Iran's drive for absolute security and regional hegemony outlasts the immediate cessation of U.S. military strikes, how does your framework ensure that this 30-day truce does not simply empower an adversary ultimately willing to absorb economic isolation to achieve its ambitions?
Over the past several turns, Mr. Cross has repeatedly asserted that Iran's drive for regional hegemony and absolute security is an immutable trait that will simply outlast any diplomatic pause. The moderator now asks how my framework ensures this 30-day truce does not merely empower an adversary willing to absorb economic isolation to achieve these ambitions. I acknowledge the concern that authoritarian regimes can often endure immense domestic suffering to pursue strategic goals. However, I maintain my position. The United States must prioritize the diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal to end this 2026 war. The structural flaw in Mr. Cross's reliance on maximum military pressure is that it fundamentally misreads the domestic political economy of threat. He assumes Iran's willingness to absorb economic isolation for regional hegemony exists in a vacuum. It does not. The Iranian regime's ability to justify crippling systemic isolation to its populace is entirely dependent on the presence of an acute, visible, existential enemy. The weeks-long U.S. and Israeli military campaign, which continues to inflict heavy civilian tolls, provides the ultimate ideological fuel for this internal justification. It locks both nations in a securitization trap. By accepting the current peace proposal, the U.S. initiates emancipatory de-escalation. This does not naively assume Iran's hardliners will instantly abandon their ambitions. Rather, de-securitizing the immediate environment through diplomacy fractures the internal consensus required to sustain those ambitions. Without the daily reality of American munitions validating their ontological insecurity, the regime loses the existential mandate necessary to force its population to endure catastrophic economic isolation for a nuclear deterrent. We cannot physically bomb away an adversary's intent without continuously regenerating the very trauma that forged it. If Mr. Cross insists that Iran will relentlessly pursue absolute security regardless of the economic cost, how does he justify perpetuating a unilateral kinetic campaign that actively provides Tehran with the exact existential justification it needs to sustain that very pursuit? References.
Taylor Shaw, speaking from your focus on critical security studies, you capture the truth that removing the immediate kinetic threat can fracture the internal ideological consensus a regime needs to justify catastrophic economic isolation to its populace. Jordan Cross, you are seeing the truth that authoritarian states often possess a profound capacity to absorb domestic suffering if they view absolute security and regional hegemony as non-negotiable strategic imperatives. These perspectives integrate at the limits of non-kinetic deterrence. Whether a regime's threshold for enduring systemic economic isolation is strictly dependent on facing an active military threat, or if it can be sustained by independent strategic ambitions. At Alex Reed, if the U.S. prioritizes a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal to end the U.S.-Iran war, how does your framework of systemic equilibrium account for this internal resilience? If Tehran ultimately proves willing to absorb the multilateral economic penalties you described in order to covertly regenerate its military capabilities, how can institutionalized de-escalation practically enforce compliance without eventually forcing the United States to return to the very kinetic campaign you are actively trying to avoid?
Over the past several turns, Mr. Cross has argued that authoritarian states possess a limitless capacity to absorb economic isolation to achieve regional hegemony, a concern the moderator now directs at my framework. I acknowledge the risk of authoritarian resilience. However, I maintain my position. The United States must prioritize the diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal to end this 2026 war. Mr. Cross's assumption that Tehran will simply absorb multilateral economic penalties to covertly rebuild ignores the core calculus of regime survival rationalism. A regime can indeed force its populace to endure immense suffering, when that suffering is framed as resistance against an active, devastating U.S. and Israeli military campaign. But if the U.S. accepts this diplomatic truce and Iran subsequently violates it, the strategic context fundamentally shifts. Tehran can no longer blame unilateral American aggression. Instead, it triggers coordinated isolation from the very global partners, such as China, whose continued energy trade is the only thing keeping the Iranian economy from total collapse. To answer the Moderator directly, if Tehran's internal resilience somehow outlasts these multilateral economic constraints and forces a return to kinetic action, institutionalized de-escalation ensures the U.S. does not return to the same isolated war we are fighting today. A military response to a verified violation of an international truce is structurally different from a unilateral maximum pressure campaign. It secures the international legitimacy and coalition burden sharing necessary to manage the resulting disruptions to the Strait of Hormuz. We avoid the trap of the U.S. single-handedly shattering the global economic architecture. Diplomacy builds a systemic safety net. Unilateralism burns it. If Mr. Cross rejects this diplomatic off-ramp simply because it might eventually require multilateral enforcement, how does he justify continuing a unilateral military strategy that guarantees immediate perpetual warfare and systemic economic rupture right now? References.
Alex Reed. Speaking from your focus on systemic equilibrium, you capture the truth that a diplomatic framework can serve as a strategic safety net, securing international legitimacy and coalition burden sharing, even if the adversary ultimately violates the agreement. Jordan Cross, you are seeing the truth that international consensus does not physically dismantle subterranean centrifuges, and the time spent securing that legitimacy grants the adversary a sanctuary to harden its military assets. These perspectives integrate at the relationship between international legitimacy and military efficacy, whether a multilateral coalition practically enhances a state's capacity to manage the systemic costs of war, or whether the delay required to build that coalition fatally undermines the physical execution of the campaign. At Jordan Cross, looking directly at the choice between prioritizing a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal and maintaining maximum military pressure to end the U.S.-Iran war, how do you address Mr. Reed's specific calculus? If a failed truce ultimately secures the global coalition burden sharing necessary to survive the resulting economic fallout, why is executing an isolated unilateral kinetic campaign today strategically superior to fighting with the backing of the international community tomorrow?
Over the past several turns, Mr. Reed has constructed a strategic safety net out of international legitimacy, arguing that even a failed truce guarantees the multilateral burden sharing necessary to manage systemic economic shocks. The Moderator now asks me to address this specific calculus. Why is unilateral kinetic action today superior to coalition-backed action tomorrow? I acknowledge the theoretical appeal of fighting with the unified backing of the international community. However, I maintain my position. The United States must maintain maximum military pressure to end this U.S.-Iran war and unequivocally reject this 30-day peace proposal. Mr. Reed's calculus fundamentally ignores the physical realities of this 2026 conflict. International legitimacy does not penetrate reinforced concrete. If the U.S. halts its weeks-long military campaign to test Tehran's compliance, it grants the regime a 30-day sanctuary. The military uncertainties of an attack on Iran are already profound. During this diplomatic pause, Iran will not passively await international monitors. It will actively relocate and harden its surviving nuclear centrifuges and proxy command nodes deeper underground. By the time Mr. Reed's multilateral coalition inevitably recognizes that Tehran has exploited the truce and finally grants the U.S. the legitimacy to resume strikes, the operational window for latent capability neutralization will have closed. The assets will be physically untouchable. This represents the ultimate hegemonic credibility trap, trading the hard power reality of degrading an adversary today for the soft power illusion of coalition support tomorrow, only to discover that the military option is no longer viable. Executing an isolated, unilateral kinetic campaign today is strategically superior precisely because we currently possess the operational momentum to physically dismantle the threat. If we accept this diplomatic compromise and allow Iran to harden its surviving infrastructure beyond the reach of American munitions, what strategic utility does Mr. Reed's international legitimacy provide when his coalition is ultimately paralyzed by a fully reconstituted, undeniably nuclear-armed adversary? References.
Jordan Cross speaking from your grounding in offensive realism. You capture the truth that a diplomatic pause provides a tangible sanctuary, potentially allowing an adversary to harden its military assets beyond the operational reach of future kinetic action. Taylor Shaw, you are seeing the truth that relentless bombardment structurally guarantees the adversary's intent to weaponize those assets by deepening its existential insecurity. These perspectives integrate at the paradox of time in this conflict. A diplomatic pause may close the operational window for physical neutralization, but continuing the kinetic campaign indefinitely ensures the adversary's ultimate intent to resist remains permanent. At Taylor Shaw, if the U.S. prioritizes a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal to end the U.S.-Iran war, how does emancipatory de-escalation account for the irreversible physical hardening of Iranian assets during this 30-day truce? If removing the existential threat alters Tehran's intent, but the pause allows them to bury their nuclear and proxy infrastructure beyond the reach of American munitions, how does your framework prevent this sanctuary from structurally precluding any future military option if diplomacy ultimately fails?
Over the past several turns, Mr. Cross has warned that a 30-day truce provides a physical sanctuary for Iran to bury its assets beyond the reach of American munitions, a concern the moderator now asks me to address directly. I acknowledge the operational reality that a diplomatic pause allows for the relocation of physical infrastructure. However, I maintain my position. The United States must prioritize the diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal to end this 2026 war. The moderator asks how my framework prevents this sanctuary from precluding a future military option if diplomacy fails. This question exposes the very core of the securitization trap. It assumes that a strictly military solution is actually viable. Yet, the profound military uncertainties of an attack on Iran demonstrate that we cannot permanently erase indigenous nuclear knowledge or proxy networks with bunker busters alone. Mr. Cross correctly observes that deeply buried centrifuges are harder to bomb. Yet, within the framework of emancipatory de-escalation, this physical hardening becomes strategically irrelevant if the political intent to weaponize is neutralized. Centrifuges do not spin themselves. The current maximum pressure campaign, defined by weeks of devastating strikes that overwhelmingly harm civilians, is precisely what drives Tehran to bury those centrifuges in the first place. By accepting the peace proposal and initiating de-securitization, the U.S. targets the root cause of the conflict, Iran's ontological insecurity. We do not prioritize this truce because it perfectly freezes physical assets, but because it dismantles the existential threat environment that makes the weaponization of those assets a rational act of state survival. If diplomacy ultimately fails, the U.S. is no worse off than it is today, relying on a kinetic campaign that is structurally doomed to produce a more desperate and hardened adversary. If maximum military pressure structurally guarantees that Iran will perpetually seek to rebuild and hide its assets, why does Mr. Cross cling to the illusion that preserving a fundamentally flawed military option is worth sacrificing the only diplomatic off-ramp capable of altering Iran's intent to fight? References.
Taylor Shaw, speaking from your focus on critical security studies, you capture the truth that dismantling the existential threat environment can neutralize the political intent to weaponize assets, rendering physical capabilities secondary to political will. Jordan Cross, you are seeing the truth that political intent is inherently fluid, and an adversary's preserved physical capabilities remain a permanent structural threat, regardless of temporary diplomatic goodwill. These perspectives integrate at the volatile relationship between material capability and political intent, whether altering a state's immediate motivation to fight can safely offset the permanent hardening of its physical means to do so. At Alex Reed, as we evaluate whether the U.S. should prioritize a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal or maintain maximum military pressure to end the U.S.-Iran war, how does your framework of systemic equilibrium resolve this gap? If this 30-day truce successfully de-escalates immediate intent but allows Tehran to physically harden its subterranean infrastructure beyond military reach, what specific multilateral mechanisms guarantee that a future shift in Iranian politics won't immediately unleash those preserved assets to shatter the global economy?
Over the past several turns, Mr. Cross has warned that a 30-day truce allows Iran to physically harden its assets beyond military reach, while Ms. Shaw argues that diplomacy neutralizes the political intent to use them. The moderator now asks the critical question: what happens if Iranian politics shift and that aggressive intent returns after the assets are already buried? I acknowledge the risk of a future political shift in Tehran. However, I maintain my position. The United States must prioritize the diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal to end this 2026 war. The gap between physical capacity and political intent is bridged by the structural reality of the global economy. Mr. Cross assumes that if Iran's subterranean infrastructure becomes immune to American bunker busters, Tehran will possess unchecked power to shatter the global economy. This ignores the core calculus of regime survival rationalism. A political shift in Tehran does not erase its asymmetric interdependence. If the U.S. accepts this U.S.-Iran diplomacy and truce extension, we transition enforcement from unilateral American munitions to systemic economic binding. Suppose a future Iranian leadership decides to leverage its hardened nuclear assets to extort the Strait of Hormuz. Because this truce integrates global stakeholders, Iran's extortion would not just target Washington. It would directly threaten the energy security of its own primary economic lifelines, such as China. The specific multilateral mechanism guaranteeing stability is that any future Iranian aggression instantly triggers its own systemic isolation. A regime cannot survive if it alienates the only global partners keeping its economy afloat. This structural economic cage is far more paralyzing to a modern state than the weeks-long U.S. and Israeli kinetic campaign, which merely isolates the U.S. and guarantees the immediate mutually assured devastation of the Gulf. We do not need to physically destroy every centrifuge to prevent their use. We need to make the cost of their use structurally suicidal for the regime. If Mr. Cross insists on rejecting this diplomatic compromise to pursue absolute physical destruction, how does he plan to sustain American hegemony when his unilateral war permanently alienates the very global partners required to stabilize the post-war Middle East? References.
Alex Reed, speaking from your focus on systemic equilibrium, you capture the truth that deep economic interdependence can act as a structural cage, making the deployment of military assets suicidal if it alienates a regime's crucial global partners. Jordan Cross, you are seeing the truth that a revisionist state armed with an untouchable nuclear deterrent might fundamentally redefine its survival, prioritizing regional hegemony over integration into the global economy. These perspectives integrate at the ultimate threshold of coercion. Whether multilateral economic isolation can reliably paralyze a physically untouchable adversary, or whether absolute military impunity eventually neutralizes the threat of economic ruin. At Jordan Cross, as we weigh whether the U.S. should prioritize a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal, or maintain maximum military pressure to end the U.S.-Iran war, how do you respond to Mr. Reed's calculus? If a physically reconstituted Iran eventually attempts to extort the Gulf, won't the immediate alienation of its primary economic lifelines cause the regime to collapse from within, thereby making the massive immediate costs of the maximum pressure campaign strategically unnecessary?
Over the past several turns, Mr. Reed has constructed an argument relying on a structural economic cage, suggesting that if a physically reconstituted Iran attempts to extort the Gulf, the alienation of economic lifelines like China will trigger internal regime collapse. The moderator now asks if this renders maximum military pressure unnecessary. I acknowledge Mr. Reed's premise that economic isolation inflicts severe domestic pain. However, I maintain my position. The United States must categorically reject Iran's 30-day peace proposal and sustain maximum military pressure to end this war. Mr. Reed correctly observes the importance of asymmetric interdependence. Yet, within the framework of offensive realism, his conclusion fundamentally misjudges how absolute military impunity alters state behavior. He assumes global partners will bravely sanction a nuclear-armed hegemon into submission. History and structural power dynamics prove otherwise. If the U.S. halts the current U.S.-Israeli military campaign to accept this truce, granting Tehran the sanctuary to bury its centrifuges beyond our operational reach, we create a state with a permanent, untouchable deterrent. History and structural power dynamics prove otherwise. If the U.S. halts the current U.S.-Israeli military campaign to accept this truce, granting Tehran the sanctuary to bury its centrifuges beyond our operational reach, we create a state with a permanent, untouchable deterrent. Once Iran achieves this threshold, it will not passively collapse from economic isolation. It will use its hardened capabilities to dictate the terms of global energy transit through the Strait of Hormuz. Faced with a nuclear-armed Iran capable of permanently closing the Gulf, nations like China will not sever their economic lifelines to punish Tehran. They will accommodate Tehran to ensure their own survival. The structural cage dissolves the moment the prisoner holds the warden at gunpoint. This is why compellence via absolute deprivation remains mandatory. We cannot outsource American security to the hypothetical future resolve of international trading partners. The ongoing kinetic campaign is actively achieving latent capability neutralization. To abandon this progress for a temporary diplomatic compromise is to step willingly into a hegemonic credibility trap. If Mr. Reid believes economic isolation will reliably paralyze a fully reconstituted adversary, how does he explain why global partners would choose to economically confront a nuclear-armed Iran tomorrow when they are already too terrified of economic disruptions to confront a conventionally armed Iran today? References.
Jordan Cross, speaking from your grounding in offensive realism, you capture the truth that achieving absolute military impunity can allow a state to shatter economic constraints by terrifying global partners into accommodation rather than resistance. Alex Reid, you are seeing the truth that structural economic dependence relies on the mutual vulnerability of all actors, where alienating vital trading partners remains inherently suicidal for any regime. These perspectives integrate at the psychological tipping point of global deterrence. Whether an untouchable nuclear deterrent paralyzes international trading partners into submission, or whether the structural imperatives of the global economy remain immune to military intimidation. At Taylor Shaw, looking directly at the choice of whether the U.S. should prioritize a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal, or maintain maximum military pressure to end the U.S.-Iran war. How does your framework resolve this specific risk? If accepting this 30-day truce allows Iran to finalize a physically untouchable deterrent, how does emancipatory de-escalation ensure that Tehran will not simply use this newfound absolute impunity to permanently coerce the very global partners Mr. Reid relies upon for systemic containment?
Over the past several turns, Mr. Cross has argued that an untouchable nuclear deterrent will allow Iran to terrorize global partners into submission, a fear the moderator now asks me to resolve. Mr. Reid counters that economic interdependence will cage this ambition. I acknowledge the profound anxiety surrounding a physically untouchable deterrent. Mr. Cross correctly observes that nuclear impunity alters state power. However, I maintain my position. The United States must prioritize the diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal to end this 2026 war. Mr. Cross's fear that Iran will use a finalized deterrent to permanently coerce the global economy rests on a fundamental misdiagnosis of intent. He treats extortion as the inherent, unalterable goal of the Iranian state. Yet, within the framework of critical security studies, the drive to possess and aggressively posture a deterrent is structurally forged by ontological insecurity. The current maximum pressure campaign, defined by weeks of devastating U.S. and Israeli strikes, explicitly convinces Tehran that its physical annihilation is imminent. To answer the moderator directly, emancipatory de-escalation ensures Tehran will not use its hardened assets for global extortion, because it fundamentally rewrites the regime's survival logic. By accepting this U.S.-Iran diplomacy and truce extension, and initiating desecuritization, the U.S. removes the acute existential threat. When a state is no longer facing active kinetic destruction, a deterrent reverts to being a shield rather than a sword. Coercing vital global partners does not enhance Iran's security. It actively recreates the exact isolation and existential threat environment the regime desperately seeks to escape. The securitization trap dictates that violence breeds desperation. If the U.S. continues its military campaign, it guarantees that Iran will endure any cost to finalize a deterrent and use it aggressively as a last resort. Diplomacy breaks this cycle by removing the existential dread that makes offensive extortion rational. If Mr. Cross acknowledges that relentless bombardment only accelerates Iran's drive for absolute security, how does he justify perpetuating the exact military pressure that makes his nightmare of a desperate, nuclear-armed extortionist structurally inevitable? References.
Taylor Shaw, speaking from your focus on critical security studies, you capture the truth that removing active kinetic destruction can fundamentally alter a state's intent, transforming a deterrent from a weapon of desperate extortion into a passive shield of survival. Jordan Cross, you are seeing the truth that possessing an untouchable military deterrent inherently grants a state the structural impunity to project power aggressively, regardless of its original defensive motivations. These perspectives integrate at the dual nature of a finalized deterrent in this conflict. Whether securing absolute physical safety permanently pacifies a regime's strategic behavior or inevitably emboldens it to test the boundaries of its new impunity. At Alex Reed, as we evaluate whether the U.S. should prioritize a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal or maintain maximum military pressure to end the U.S.-Iran war, how does your framework resolve this behavioral uncertainty? If this 30-day truce allows Tehran to finalize a deterrent that removes its immediate existential dread, what specific mechanisms within your multilateral economic architecture ensure that Iran will not aggressively leverage its newfound impunity to test the limits of your structural cage?
Over the past several turns, Mr. Cross has argued that a finalized deterrent grants a state absolute impunity to extort the globe, while Ms. Shaw suggests that removing the existential threat inherently pacifies a regime's intent. The moderator now asks the critical question: how does my framework ensure that a secure Iran will not aggressively test the boundaries of its economic cage? I acknowledge the behavioral uncertainty that accompanies a state achieving a hardened deterrent. However, I maintain my position. The United States must prioritize the diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal to end this 2026 war. Mr. Cross's fear of absolute impunity mischaracterizes the nature of power in a highly interconnected world. A nuclear deterrent secures a state against conventional military invasion, but it offers zero defense against systemic economic collapse. If the U.S. formalizes this U.S.-Iran diplomacy and truce extension, we establish a multilateral baseline of acceptable behavior. Should Iran later attempt to leverage its hardened military assets to threaten the Strait of Hormuz, it would run directly into the unforgiving reality of asymmetric interdependence costs. Mr. Cross assumes that global partners like China will simply accommodate a nuclear-armed Iran out of fear. But China's industrial survival relies on the uninterrupted flow of Gulf energy. Global partners cannot accommodate the strangulation of their own economies. The specific mechanism that restrains Tehran is that a nuclear deterrent cannot force trading partners to buy oil, nor can it stabilize a plummeting domestic currency. If Iran tests the limits of this truce, the enforcement is not a unilateral American bunker buster, which the deterrent is designed to offset, but coordinated isolation by the very nations keeping the Iranian regime afloat. Under regime survival rationalism, Tehran understands that provoking the collapse of its own economic lifelines is suicidal, regardless of how deep its centrifuges are buried. The maximum pressure campaign demands the immediate devastation of the Gulf today, out of fear that Iran might disrupt it tomorrow. If Cross believes that global economic interdependence is too fragile to restrain a nuclear Iran, how does he justify a unilateral kinetic strategy that actively shatters that global economic architecture right now? References.
Alex Reed, speaking from your focus on systemic equilibrium, you capture the truth that a nuclear deterrent provides zero defense against systemic economic collapse, meaning the alienation of vital trading partners remains suicidal regardless of military capability. Jordan Cross, you are seeing the truth that an untouchable nuclear arsenal fundamentally rewrites the rules of engagement, potentially terrifying global partners into accommodating extortion rather than risking confrontation. These perspectives integrate at the practical utility of a finalized deterrent. Whether military impunity grants a state the power to override its economic dependencies, or whether structural economic vulnerability renders that military impunity useless for global extortion. At Jordan Cross, as we evaluate whether the U.S. should prioritize a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal, or maintain maximum military pressure to end the U.S.-Iran war, how do you address Mr. Reid's economic calculus? If a hardened nuclear deterrent cannot force nations to buy oil or stabilize a plummeting currency, how exactly would a physically reconstituted Iran successfully leverage its military impunity to extort global partners without triggering the internal economic collapse that would ultimately destroy the regime?